So before we start, I just want to address a couple of things. I did end up pressing one or two of the pattern pieces, and that was only so that it would lay a little bit better on the dress form. Also, I wanted to mention that this dress form squeaks a ton. If you haven't seen some of the previous videos, it squeaks a ton. I just want to apologize in advance. I'm not sure exactly what to do exactly to get it to stop squeaking, but I just want to let you guys know in advance, it does squeak a ton. So with that being said, let's get started on actually laying our pattern on the dress form. What we're about to do is called a tissue fitting. So it's basically, this pattern is made out of what we would think is like a tissue type fabric. And we're going to take this pattern and fit it on our form just to kind of get a general idea of how well this fits. And this is just another sort of step to ensure that we're not going to go ahead and waste fabric when we can have as many steps as possible to prevent that. So one of those things are tissue fittings, and the second thing which we'll do is the muslin mock-up, which is going to be another sort of perfectioning tool before we take it to our final form. So a couple of key things. This part of the dress form is called the center front, and if you're wondering why you see that on pattern, that's because it's talking about this part. So when you're often drafting a muslin mock-up, or not muslin mock-up, when you're drafting the pattern, when you go into that advance, you'll see that for the most part, unless it's an intricate design that requires you to have the full face of the pattern, you're only going to have half of it. So for this, I am first going to just line up this center front with the center line of my pattern, and just take a pin and just stick one there at the waistline where it says noted waistline. And then I'm going to stick another one here at the neckline, right at the top. So smooth it out. At the top of your pattern, you'll notice these three little dots, and they're markings. They're actually to indicate where the neckline is. So again, as we discuss markings on a pattern, you'll see that each one of them have their reason for being there. So for this one, we have the waistline, and it tells me to sit my pattern at the waist with just a little bit excess at the bottom. And then this point up here where I have my size 8, it lets me know to stick my pin there because this is the neckline that I'm going to be going for. And just make sure that sits nice and even. Okay, so the next step is I'm going to, now all patterns come with about 5/8 seam allowance. And what's the seam allowance? Seam allowance is exactly what it sounds like. It's allowing room for a seam. So when you have your seam, like right now, this is going to need more seam allowance, because if I just use this stitch, so for example, if I didn't add any excess, what's going to happen is I'm going to use, and this one says seam allowance 1, seam 1 inch. So you have to read for how much seam allowance they're giving you. So this is supposed to actually be 1 inch. Most of the time it's 5/8. I would stick with 5/8 if you're not really familiar with rulers and the grid measurements. Then yeah, just go the full 1 inch. That's a lot easier. Either way, there's not enough here. Seam allowance should allow that, let me just pin it there, that there's going to be excess fabric with the measurement of about 1 inch that's going to allow me to create a seam and then have a little bit left over. So when you're looking inside any article of clothing, you'll see that there's the stitch and the seam, and then there's an extra amount of fabric, usually like 5/8, 1 inch. That's the seam allowance. In this form, I don't have any. So I'm going to have to, when I lay this back out, I'm going to have to go add it to this pattern so that I can have actual seam allowance. So we're going to smooth that over the shoulder. And again, patterns aren't an exact match, but they're a lot easier to navigate than trying to, especially if you're a beginner, than trying to do an original pattern from scratch. So this just kind of gives you a rough overview, and it allows you to be more familiar with the way a pattern should look. So this smooths out. I'm going to pin for my shoulders. And that's going to be the front of my pattern. Okay, so we see there's a little bit of excess here. We're going to leave that until we get to the muslin stage. We see that there's maybe a little excess here in the shoulder that I don't particularly need. We might want to remove some of that, but I'm going to wait until I put my back on before I remove some of that. So the front, it says it's going to be on a fold, meaning when we put our fabric down, that's going to be on the fold of the fabric. We're just going to cut around it so that when we open it up, it's going to be two sides. So that's the front. So when you see center front fold, that's what that means. It means you're going to place the pattern on a fold so that when you cut around it, it opens up. However, for the back, we're going to need to cut two pieces. So for that, you're actually going to see that there's a center front line, which is about 1/2 inch off. And then there's this excess space. You're going to make sure you stick to that center front, even if it means that there's going to be a little bit excess out of the side. So again, I'm going to mark inside of that size 8. This is the center back line. This excess you see is going to be what I'm going to use for seam allowance. So pivot my dress form to the side, because now the goal is to start to connect my side seam. And I'm going to go ahead and say, well, I'm going to feel down if you have the dress form. If not, you're supposed to be creating a side seam. So for my dress form, I'm going to have to mark some of this off. And this is sort of the, again, the benefits of having the dress form, because you get to see where it's off. So as I rub my marking, you'll be able to see that I created a new seam line. I'm not going to do anything with it now, but I just have this marking here, so when it's time for me to go back and make my adjustments, I can. My back, we're going to try to smooth that out. I'm going to connect my shoulders. If you don't have a dress form, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to see how some of these adjustments are. But when you do the muslin mock-up, and it allows you to try it on yourself, then you'll be able to see, okay, here's some of the issues that I'm having as far as the fitting. Some people just like to go ahead and do the full pattern because they don't have a dress form, and then they just sew it up and it's kind of off a little bit. I mean, that's not terrible, but if you want precision garments, whether you're making for yourself or someone else, you do want to get some sort of dress form, because that's the best way to really finite everything and make sure that everything looks the way you want it to look. Otherwise, you're just making a customized version. So it's a custom garment that you made for yourself, but it's not truly custom because you're just taking the store-bought measurements and just applying it to yourself. This is my top. Okay, so now we just do the same thing. Actually, we're going to go to the sleeve. Now on the sleeve, you're going to see these notches here. These are called notches. So you're going to be using those notches and connecting them to each other. You also have 2 for the back and 1 for the front. Why these are important? Because if you interchange them, the sleeve is going to hang in a weird way, because your back is actually in the front, and it's probably going to be like some awkward bunching. So make sure that when you're doing your sleeve, that you look at those marks and make sure that the back goes to the back and the front goes to the front. So I'm going to take my sleeve pattern and using these balancing lines. So all these lines you see on the sleeves or on the garments, these are balancing lines along with your grain lines. If you read the pattern, it lets you know exactly what these lines are for. This line right here is just to let you know that this line should be in your center, and it should match up with your shoulder line. So you just want to make sure you're very aware of that. And I'm just going to stick a pin right in there. I'm going to go to my size 8 mark and stick a pin right in there. So again, I'm not going to put it at the very edge. I'm going to follow that marking. I'm going to stick it at the size 8. And I'm going to do it right here, as well as here. This is all letting me know, okay, this is a size 8. So as you can see, you're starting to see that shoulder forming. And then I'm just going to wrap this with the notches. Now, if we just did the dress form, we're not doing super fitted sleeves. We're just going to do some relaxed sleeves. Again, we're in our beginner's phase. So the contouring, you just want to get the basic understanding. So you don't want to go too crazy with trying to contour the dress. Obviously, your waist and your shoulders, you want to make sure those are accurate, but I wouldn't go too crazy with the contouring of the sleeves. This is like a pretty good sleeve. Okay, I do actually, now that I'm looking at it, I don't know if that's as long as I want it to be. So what I would do is I would just get a pencil and I would say, you know what? I thought that this would be a good length. I'm actually not really interested in coming that far down. So I'm just going to make a little mark. I'm not going to do anything with this mark yet. I'm just going to mark it so I know, okay, that's something that I should look at. What does that look like from this lengthening line? Okay, home stretch. We're going to do our skirt. If you can see the skirt, these are more matching lines. You cannot ignore these lines because they're going to help you with matching everything. There's a notch line right there. And when I put my skirt on, I'm just going to match it. And I say, oh, okay, that matches. I'm going to again take a look at my center front. You have a nice balancing line. It's sitting nicely. You got a good amount of seam allowance, so that's looking really good. So this is what we got so far for our front. So everything is looking nice and balanced. Our lines are matching up nicely because that's what you want when you sew for your finished garment. You want those lines to match up. That is an indication that you have a well-made garment when the seams match up. I mean, the worst thing to do is finish a garment and realize, oh no, the seams are off, because it kind of gives it this homemade look. You want to make sure all the seams are lining up. And then you just do the same thing for the back. And to spare you guys too much squeaking, I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing to the back. It's off just a little bit because you want to create space to create a closure. So whether it's a zipper, if you want to go crazy and make buttons all the way down, be my guest, but we're just creating seam allowance for a closure. Garment. Around a little bit. I didn't close this up here. And I just closed up the sleeve so it just looked a little bit cleaner on the model. So there you go. That is our tissue fitting. I'm just going to make some markings on the shoulder so that when I remove this, I know, okay, I have to make a couple of adjustments. There we go. So that is my pattern. The facing, if you're wondering, this is the front facing. And this is just what's going to go right here. So it's just going to be an excess piece of fabric that is going to go here. And it's what's going to finish off the top of the dress really beautifully so it looks well made. Now you can decide not to line this garment, so you can leave it just as it is when we first cut it with the fabric, or you can line it. If you're in the beginner stage, you want to leave it unlined. You want to leave it unlined and you want to just stay with the satisfaction that you completed a complete dress. If you're feeling confident, I'll briefly go over how to do it with lining, but this helps when you're not going to do a lining. You can use this with the lining, but it definitely assists when you decide not to use one. So that is it for our pattern portion of this lesson. Next, we're going to cover taking these pieces off, altering them, and then applying them to our muslin. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos are uploaded weekly covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.